For joining today. This is probably the part of the afternoon when you're maybe a little bit tired, need a little bit of a wake up, and so I hope this promises to be an invigorating conversation on emerging technologies, the promise and peril. I am very pleased to have with me Teresa Carlson. She is the Vice President of Worldwide Public Sector for Amazon Web Services. And if you haven't heard of Amazon Web Services, they are basically storing the data of much of the world these days. Stacey Dixon, the Deputy Director of Intelligence Advanced Research Projects, also known as IARPA. If you don't know what IARPA is, think of it as sort of the DARPA of the intelligence community. She previously had assignments at the National Reconnaissance Office, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and the House Intelligence Committee. We are also joined by Congressman Will Hurd from Texas, a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He is also a former CIA officer. And we have, last but not least, Sam Visner. He's the Director of National Cybersecurity for the federally funded Research and Development Center, FFRDC, or MITRE. You guys do love your acronyms in government. And he is also a former Signals Intelligence Chief for the NSA. I wanted to actually start, before we get into this very exciting conversation about emerging technologies, to do something awful and ask about politics. I wanted to ask Congressman Hurd about an op-ed you wrote this morning that was published in the New York Times. And let me just read two sentences from it. Over the course of my career as an undercover officer in the CIA, I saw Russian intelligence manipulate many people. I never thought I would see the day when an American president would be one of them. My question for you, Congressman Hurd, is why did you write this op-ed? And do you see, and this was obviously probably written and submitted before the news of yesterday when we learned that the president plans to invite Russian President Putin to the White House this fall. Why did you write this op-ed, number one? And number two, do you think anything productive can come from a meeting with President Putin in the United States?
And I have an hour to answer this question.
I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
So I wrote it, one, because what happened in Helsinki, to me, was an example of classic disinformation. I'm having Vladimir Putin standing up there and making some outrageous claims about Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and doing that standing next to the leader of the free world, and there not be a rebuttal, was exactly what Vladimir Putin was hoping to happen. And in order to deal and thwart that, we have to talk about ultimately these problems. The other reason I wrote it is so people know that there are things already going on in Congress to try to address this. You know, Congress has actually been out in the forefront when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Congress is, we just passed out of the House the Intelligence Authorization Act, which has further money to the intelligence community in order to deal with people trying to hack our elections and our digital infrastructure. It has increased reporting requirements from the intelligence community. This is something that needs to pass the Senate and get ultimately to the president's desk. When it comes to disinformation, we all know Vladimir Putin his ability to get that message out is unparalleled. And we have to be talking about this. We have to know what they're trying to do. And we have to make sure that everyday folks need to understand, why is this important to them? Vladimir Putin is interested in one thing and one thing only: reestablishing the territorial integrity of the USSR. And he knows he can't do that militarily or economically, so he has to resort to asymmetrical warfare. And that is ultimately using technology, hacking into our systems, and disinformation. And so what we have to do is, how do we counter that disinformation? How do we use the tools and technology available to us? Because guess what? Their ability to do disinformation is going to get even harder once they get to artificial intelligence. Once they're trying to get to quantum as well. And so this is a race, and they're going to use those tools to continue to do the things that they've been doing for 30 years.
So I would assume you're not a big fan of the idea of a meeting with him in Washington?
No, I'm not, because what do we get out of it, right? If Vladimir Putin wants to change his relationship with the West, and specifically the United States, then guess what? Leave Ukraine. The fact that he wants to articulate what's happening in eastern Ukraine and Crimea as a separatist movement. No, it's not a separatist movement. It is Russian troops, Russian tanks invaded another country. So if you want to have normal relations, then leave Ukraine, then turn over the 12 intelligence officers that were involved in trying to manipulate our elections. There's a lot of other preconditions that should be met before you have a general conversation. And we should be talking about how are we going to try to change the nature of the relationship. And guess what? Many other presidents have tried to change the nature of the relationship with Russia and specifically Vladimir Putin and have failed. And so let's not open up that box until we have clear goals on what we should accomplish. And we should make sure that they come to the table with establishing some of these preconditions or following through on some of those preconditions.
Okay. We will get back to the topic of our panel now.
I tried bringing artificial intelligence.
That was,
in.
I was going to say, it's not so disconnected.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I thought we start off with actually a little round robin, because I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, and there's so many technologies we could talk about, and I just don't want to miss some of the highlights. Can we just quickly go down the line, starting with Teresa, on the one technology that either keeps you up at night or makes you most excited in terms of its promise, or both? So just say what that technology is and say promise, peril, or both, and let's make sure to work that in, whatever that technology is in our conversation. So Teresa.
So you may not like my answer,
Don't
but I'm
say
going to
cloud.
say cloud computing. And here's why, because it's so much promise and it's still so misunderstood. And it's cloud computing is so much more than one technology, clearly, but it is a basis for how you can move so much faster. And so I just feel like to pick one thing out of that wouldn't do it justice, because there's so many things that can be enabled because of cloud computing.
Okay, so cloud and promise. Let's keep it short. Stacey.
Sure. Synthetic biology or engineered biology would be the one that I'd pick, and that's both promise and peril.
Okay, great. We'll definitely get back to that.
Quantum
Congressman
computing, both.
And both. And Sam.
5G, because it's going to create an entirely new cyber ecosystem around the world, one that we're not prepared to, in which we're not prepared to defend our interests.
Great. Well, Teresa, let's continue on what you were saying about cloud. I think cloud is misunderstood. It's hard to grasp. It's hard to grasp when you hear that Amazon, Google, and other cloud providers from Silicon Valley, for example, are trying to become partners with the government and put the government's data on the cloud, and trying to understand what would that look like and what does that mean. Explain to us and maybe give us an example of what emerging technologies can come about with the underlying infrastructure of cloud.
Well, in the government, as an example, for years they've had it's began to be outdated in the way that they utilize technology. And thanks to our congressional leaders, we do have IT modernization acts and policies going on out there. But the US government and around the world tends to use a lot of old style, where they build data centers, they replace their servers, and they just sort of wait and see what happens. And they don't have a way to experiment. And if you take the US government, 80% of the funds they spend on IT are on maintenance, not innovation. So think about that. It's
and
really
the budget's
pretty
what, like
crazy.
$1 trillion
Yeah,
a year,
well,
something
it's
like that?
bigger and bigger. And you know, the budget, I would say we don't even really know the number, because you talk about IT and then you talk about mission. And if you combine those two, it's much bigger than we actually do see. But there's a lot of those funds that are actually spent on maintenance. And really what's happened with cloud computing, we came into the market in 2010. I started our business, and we came in for a very kind of basic reason, which was to provide government the same capabilities that any citizen gets today through how they use technology. And the ability to experiment, fail fast, have agility, have the reduced price that we provide to all of our customers. So we felt it was important, and we heard it from our customers. And also we were drawn in from our partner community, who said, we'd like to see you there. So it's really picked up steam, and now they see it as the new norm, just like if you go to a Silicon Valley startup, they don't know any other way. If you go to a startup in Israel, if you go to a startup anywhere, they don't know any other model except the use of cloud computing when it comes to powering their tool.
Can you give one good example in the security field where an application, a cloud application, is being used either by the US government or overseas that you think is really something that could be either a groundbreaking application or
Well, so the one thing that we're seeing being used a lot of, and I always say our customers are the smartest, they're like amazing. They take tools and technologies and really put them to work. And there's a tool called Kinesis. It's AWS Kinesis that does streaming of live data and analysis of that live data. And we're seeing our customers utilize that tool for streaming of cyber attacks. So they can take and understand within their environment what's happening on an ongoing basis and do that real-time analysis. And one good example is Army Cyber Command looks at all the attacks coming into them. And they're running they have about 500 terabytes of data, and they've identified over 5,000 attacks and now looked at countermeasures in real time. So the thing about, I'll go back to cloud, why is it so important? Because you can get real-time information on an ongoing basis and do that real-time analysis. And there's other tools that come into that, like machine learning, data analytics. There's lots of tools, but the thing is now you can combine those and they can work together, whereas in my earlier days of tech, I'll just say, a lot of these tools would not work well together. Through cloud applications, you can build things very rapidly, and you can fail fast and recover fast. So when you build a tool or an API capability, you can, if that's not working, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can utilize what's working well and then be additive to it. You don't have to shut it down and start all over. But cyber, the tools that are being used as countermeasures, I would say, analytics and countermeasures, and they can also look at internal cyber activities that are going on. So not only do you look at externally what's happening, but internally, because guns, guards, fences, and dogs don't protect your data anymore.
But there is a comfort level in being able to have that fence around all of your own data. But I think in terms of being able to take advantage of the commercial offerings, the apps that are now available in the cloud that we can bring to our data, we definitely want to increase that comfort level. We at IARPA see a world in the future where maybe one day we're actually comfortable putting the classified data in places that right now we are not comfortable putting it. And we're looking at whether or not, what can we do to increase the confidence that the government has that we can all protect the data. And we're working very closely with partners to make sure we can get to that place.
And we do have a classified cloud with the intelligence community,
Correct.
which is top secret and secret, which is now you have those comforts within the different classifications of networks, which I agree with you is completely important when you're talking about intelligence data.
And we should be actually talking about multiple cloud environments, not just a single cloud environment.
Right.
And if anybody is not talking about transitioning into the cloud, that should not be the conversation. The conversation should be, what are we going to do and how do we defend that and make sure that the steps, we're taking the steps in order to protect it? Because, look, this is not emerging technology. It has
Right, this
emerged.
is today.
And so we need to be taking advantage of it because of the efficiency it brings us and the computing power it actually brings us as well.
Well, trust is a big issue here, as you bring up. And, I know this is not directly related, but just this week on Amazon's big Prime Day, you had a crash, and there's also just resistance culturally to working with the private sector for something so important like sensitive data. How do you breach, or how do you bridge, I should say, the gap in trust? And I can ask Teresa or anybody else in the panel on that, between private and public.
Well, look, I think it starts with knowing what good digital system hygiene is, right? And so when I got out of the CIA, I helped start a cybersecurity company. So we basically broke into banks, stole their money, and show them how we did it, right? And guess what? I will always get in. And so the question is, how quickly can you detect me? Can you quarantine me? And can you kick me out? Yeah. And ultimately, the biggest point of failure is going to be people. And I will always be able to get someone to click on something they shouldn't be able to click on. And that's ultimately how most of these things happen. And it's not like zero-day attacks or what have you. A zero-day is a vulnerability in software that has never been seen before. Most of the major attacks and that we talk about or dealt with are all stuff that we knew about. So if you patched your software, if you did those basic things, you would be able to defend your digital hygiene. So the question about trust, to me, it's about making sure federal CIOs are doing everything they can in order to do the basics, because that's going to defend you against 92% of the attacks.
Yeah. Look, Cecilia, I remember going back a few years ago that people said, well, cloud will never be secure. I'd never put information in the cloud that I regarded as proprietary or corporate sensitive or PII. And then we learned that it's like saying, well, I would never drive a car because, I like my horse and buggy. So you can keep your horse and buggy, but there's no place to drive it. We're at the point now where we're going to be doing cloud on orbit. We're going to have satellite-based cloud storage. That's happening now. That's when people talk about, is it going to happen? You can look in the rearview mirror and see that it happened. people said, well, we won't use cloud for critical infrastructure. GE predicts, C3 IoT. They're using cloud analytics now to help make decisions about the management of resources and infrastructure. And I would say pretty soon we're actually going to manage the infrastructure through cloud architectures. So the question is not, are we going to use it, but how can we use it securely? NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, is doing important work on the development of an architecture for secure cloud, a reference architecture that can act to anchor other designs. There are tools in terms of multi-factor authentication and other tools that are coming online that makes these things secure. So I think the challenge for us is not to say, oh my God, how do I protect myself from the cloud? It's how are we going to protect ourselves properly? And one last point. People used to say, well, you know, I'd rather protect information on my laptop than in the cloud. So you mean the laptop that you haven't patched, doesn't have a firewall, could get stolen, you know, that you let somebody else in your family or your office borrow? You mean that laptop? That's the one.
And your password's password.
No, password 1, 2, 3.
My bad.
Right.
1, 2,
4.
3,
Yeah.
4.
Well,
that to make it confusing. So I think, you know, cloud represents actually, you know, a strong opportunity to get it right if we're not sloppy and we're not lazy and we do get it right.
And I, you know, speaking of like thinking of outages, you know, I can tell you that the government every day experiences massive outages in their data centers. But the great thing that's happening now is there's transparency when things happen. So for AWS, well, of course, you know, we've had glitches where we had some outages, but we're so transparent about it. And the thing that I love, when you're a builder and you run toward hard problems and not away from them, you can learn a lot from those things. And if you look, like, we're very open. Anytime there's been an issue, we always do what we call a COE, or root cause analysis. And you can go to our website and we will tell you everything that happened and what we're doing about it. And we always come up with innovations as a result of those kind of problems. And I'll just go back to, if you can move faster and have agility and learn from those glitches and move forward, you can't hide, you can't run from the things that are happening. You have to be open and transparent with your customers. You have to build trust. And back to in the early days, I remember I would walk in, when I started this business, I would go in and they would say, no way, no cloud, you're not secure,
Right.
It's never happening. But now, today, I would tell you that the primary reason people are moving to the cloud is because of security. Of the things we're talking about, the ability for visibility, analytics, tuning, looking at what's actually coming to you. That would not be possible today in data centers that are sitting there that are improperly patched or used.
So the cultural change has happened.
Yes.
And Stacey, I do want to get to a different kind of cultural issue, and it comes down to norms. And you mentioned synthetic biology. First, can you explain to our audience what is synthetic biology? What is the promise and the peril, if you will? What are your concerns as you look about, and how is the U.S. Researching and developing synthetic biology vis-a-vis other countries such as China?
So synthetic biology is the ability to take the genetic pieces, our DNA, and put them together in different ways to come up with organisms that do not naturally occur. And we've seen it in simple ways, like being able to edit the genome to be able to target specific diseases that perhaps we were trying to prevent a child from having. We've seen research like that talked about overseas, and we're getting closer to the place where the US may be interested in, well, we've done research in it, but in terms of actually putting it out into use, it's still a very difficult conversation to have, because we're still trying to make sure we understand the implications of, if you edit a piece of the genome, do you understand what's going to happen in the rest of the genome? Do you understand all the unintended consequences? That's the good use, to be able to help diseases, to be able to take, for example, to focus on the mosquitoes that carry malaria, and to be able to make them sterile so that they cannot reproduce. That is something that was contemplated. Having said that, on the other side is, you can use the same tools to be able to put in pathogens, toxins, productions of things that would cause harm, that if put out into the wild would be very dangerous to people, animals, agriculture. And there's the balance of the good things you can do with synthetic biology, bad things that you do either accidentally, such as bio-error, or the things people do on purpose,
Like
such as
the fly,
bioterror.
remember the fly, where the guy got in with the fly?
Hollywood has some good ideas with things.
Science fiction.
That's a
That was
bio-error.
science fiction, yeah,
Exactly.
bio-error.
And is the U.S. is thinking about this balance? Are other nations as hesitant? Do they not have those red lines And what does that mean for this emerging technology and our security going forward? If you could be specific.
Absolutely. So definitely, I would say that the U.S. has a very high value standard when it comes to this. We're often the ones that are saying, let's be careful how we enter into using genetic engineering. Let's figure out what the norms are that should be used across the world. We are very hesitant to use it, for example, for cosmetic reasons. You know, you're not going to just go and pick the color of your child's eyes. You're not going to pick their height just because, well, that's choices we've made. There are other places where picking those things, trying to give your child an advantage through genetic manipulation is perfectly acceptable, or at least doesn't have the same sort of reaction as it has if you talk to a group of Americans. And when it comes to research, it's sort of the same thing. There's certain things that we're going to enable our researchers to do here, and other things that we're going to encourage them not to do, partially through the government funding that's not going to go to certain things. And there are other places where people can go and continue that research, and it's going to be a challenge. We're going to have to figure out where we continue to stand in leading in the sort of moral situation where we want to make sure that the values that we're putting forward in our science are the right ones. But if other countries are going forward and trying these things out, A, we want to make sure we understand that they're doing that, but B, what do you do and how do you compare?
How do you even know what they're doing if you can't research yourself?
Thankfully, there's a lot of publications right now, but I imagine there will be other things that people will not publish on, and then we'll have to use other means to try to learn about what's happening.
Absolutely. Congressman Hurd, can you talk a little bit about quantum? Explain for our audience exactly, just define fully, and you've talked a lot about this in opinion editorials as well, about the promise and the peril of quantum computing from a national security perspective.
Sure. So currently in computing, a bit can be a 1 or a 0, okay? And then you string a bunch of those together to do an if-then, like if this thing happens, then execute here. A quantum means a bit can be a 1, a 0, both, or neither, or all the above. Right?
Yes.
And to me, that's like a crazy example of Schrodinger's cat, right? It is thanks for the one philosophy major in the crowd that laughed. And so what that allows
Can't find
you,
that.
what that allows you to do is in a simple way is the power you get from being able to do that is incredibly significant, which means, and an example is whoever gets to true quantum computing first will be able to negate all the encryption that we've ever done to date. That is why China, that is why Russia is sucking up ciphertext. Ciphertext is you have, whatever your piece of information is, you encrypt it, that encrypted data gets transported, and it's in the air, you can pick it up, but you don't know how to read it because you don't have the key to decrypt it. So what Russia and China are doing is they're sucking all this ciphertext up because once they achieve quantum, they're going to be able to break that and be able to read everything going backwards. So that is, quantum's going to get us to a point where we have to rethink encryption. But a positive is, quantum's going to be able to do some molecular modeling that we can't do now, that is going to reduce the amount of time it takes to bring medicines to the forefront. Another more basic example is driverless cars. To achieve true efficiencies with driverless cars, you're going to have all the driverless cars talking to one another. And right now, the best algorithms, the best computers can do maybe 500 vehicles. Right? That ain't going to work in NYC or Tokyo, right? And so quantum is what's going to allow us to have the computing power in order to achieve that type of issue. Another example, Fort Davis Observatory is in my district. It's the third largest telescope in the world. And they are looking at trying to categorize 1 million exoplanets. An exoplanet is a planet outside of our solar system that could potentially support life. This is a data problem. And so we do not have the computing power to analyze that kind of data. So that is another thing that I think quantum is going to be able to help us achieve.
So how's Washington thinking about quantum? We're really great at looking back. At this
sure.
conference, there's a lot of talk about social media and interference still, and that's kind of looking back like, wow, we now know what happened in 2016. I've heard that quite a bit over the last few days. there are so many things, not even just around the corner, like within sight.
Sure.
Is Washington?
So there's
the bad
probably
or-
4 members of Congress talking about it, and 3 of them are here this weekend, right? Daryl Issa from San Diego is probably in the crowd here somewhere. And then also Chairman Mike McCall from Austin, Chairman of Homeland Security. This is something he's thinking about. But the 4th person would be another Texan, Lamar Smith, who just put forward a proposal to establish a national coordinator for quantum computing within the White House to kind of drive a strategy on how we do this in order to focus investments from the federal government and to be working with the right folks in the private sector in order to achieve this first. China is doing, look, China, this is one of the areas that by 2049 they're trying to become the world leader in, and I would say right now it's tied. And this quantum coordinator is similar to what we did in nanotechnology. Probably about 15 years ago, there was a coordinator of nanotechnology in order to drive this, and it did its job because now every industry that does something with nanotechnology has started to do more advancements in that area. So that is probably the best piece of legislation right now in Washington. But when you look at the executive branch, National Science Foundation, they're doing a lot of efforts in trying to do some of the basic science. But ultimately, we need an increased amount of basic science that's happening in the federal government.
And Sam, is there the leadership in place, or is there leadership on these issues in the way that there needs to be in the U.S.? And I mentioned this in that you can't talk about what's happening in the U.S. in a vacuum when China has a Made in China 2025 policy, and they have what is essentially kind of a taboo word in the U.S., an industrial policy on this. And a lot of people feel quite uncomfortable with that. What is your thought on the policy and the leadership and coordination within government?
Well, let me answer that question by first giving an example and then making a somewhat more general observation. I think you asked, what technology do I think is exciting but also keeps me awake? And I said 5G. And in comparison to synthetic biology and quantum and all the other stuff, it sounds a lot like going down to the bus depot and watching paint dry. 5G, what is that? But as 5G is developed, it's going to create a tremendous opportunity. It will change the nature of the entire cyber ecosystem around the world. It will mean that the promise of IoT and critical infrastructure and other devices being connected directly to the internet without intermediate networks, being able to take direction from and send data to the rest of the internet, that's going to happen.
And just quickly, what is 5G?
5G is the 5th generation of the internet, but instead of it essentially the internet being parceled up into the part that your phone uses and then the other devices in your house, there will be large-scale general networks to which everything can be connected at very, very high speed.
Yeah.
This will change fundamentally the nature of the cyber ecosystem. We talk about using machine learning and artificial intelligence. We will now be able to unleash those technologies on infrastructures that are much more connected, much vaster than they were before. That's great. Now, here's the part that worries me. That ecosystem is being built not essentially on hardware designed and built in the United States, but by 3 countries, 2 of which are in Europe, and they're smaller, and 1 of which is in China. So the companies that are building the infrastructure of the next global cyber ecosystem are not U.S. firms. One of them is a Chinese firm. I'm not saying it's a bad firm, but it means that we are going to be living in an ecosystem of cyberspace that is essentially not an ecosystem that we can manage, that we can control. And let's take a look at what China thinks about cyberspace. We look at it as a global commons. China looks at cyberspace as sovereign territory. For them, cybersecurity is not about safeguarding Congressman Hurd's information. It's about regulating human conduct. And if cyberspace can be treated as sovereign, it can be conquered, it can be controlled, and it can be governed. And that is the global infrastructure that's going to be created. And the question is somebody else going to regard it as sovereign? Now, to answer your question at a more general level, the term industrial policy is a hard term. But if you go back to coming out of the Second World War, we mastered and dominated nuclear technology. We mastered and dominated aerospace and technology. We got people to the moon and back, which they probably appreciated very much. We did so by building up coordinated strategies of government and industry and academia that had White House leadership, that had national strategies with national goals. The idea that there would be a quantum coordinator who could drive the development of a national quantum R&D community, and then help that community build a whole-of-nation strategy that involves government, industry, academia, essentially the whole of nation, that's the right thing to do. And I would encourage the administration to undertake that kind of thinking. Because if we are going to predominate, or at least hold our own in these advanced technologies, we're not going to be able to leave it up to chance. And we have to decide that the high ground in those technologies isn't just a market imperative, it's in the national interest and should be treated as issues in the national interest.
And Cecilia, one of the things that is common in all that we've talked about is the United States has to show leadership on this. Because if we want these new things to evolve in a way that is good for freedom-loving people everywhere, we have to show leadership on this.
So, absolutely. Is the United States showing leadership from the top of the government, from the White House? The White House just eliminated the cybersecurity coordinator role. We're talking about the idea of a quantum coordinator role. We just eliminated the cybersecurity role. Where is leadership? Is there leadership?
Look, Michael Kratsios, who runs science and technology, he cares about these things. He's working on these strategies. You have individual folks in Congress, and you have Congress directing resources. When it comes to artificial intelligence, you have money that has been put aside. So can it be more coordinated? Absolutely. But it is happening. There are elements within the executive branch that's doing it. Now, the one area that I think was a terrible move was getting rid of the ambassador at large for cybersecurity out of the State Department. Because even now, every country doesn't have criminal laws when it comes to hacking. And so our diplomatic efforts on that, in that area is important. And so can we always show more leadership? Absolutely, because the technological change we're going to see in the next 30 years is going to make the last 30 years look insignificant. And if the U.S. is not playing that role in driving with our allies on these issues, then China's going to get there.
I think there's absolutely agreement that there needs to be leadership. I think you'd find that it's within this room, but there doesn't seem to be agreement on what to do. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned, let's pause on the idea of 5G, Sam. There was a paper that was leaked from the National Security Council about the idea of a nationalized 5G network. And that paper was very controversial. The private sector, tech companies, a lot of people within the government thought that the idea of government running a mobile network for the future was not a good idea. So there's not even agreement. I mean, and that was not necessarily, it was a paper, but it was not necessarily something that the White House had baked and was ready to propose, but it showed how divided and how there is not agreement within the government.
Well, look, two things. First, whether or not we're divided or united, let's take a look at a lot of debate over competitor, adversary, whatever. Let's take a look at our peer competitors. They have put in place strategies that have goals and benchmarks. They know what they want to achieve. They know by when they want to achieve it. They've put together the resources that they're mobilizing to achieve it, and they actually have a plan. Do we? I don't know that we do. So one of the benchmarks might be to see at least what other countries believe a plan looks like. And the second thing is, if we don't know what a plan looks like, we can look to our own history. When I take a look at the Manhattan Project, when I take a look at what people like Rickover did to build nuclear energy into the Navy, what others did to build commercial nuclear power in the United States, what others did to essentially get us to the moon, we mobilized with real plans. To me, those are excellent benchmarks. Those are excellent standards against which we could build national strategic approaches. And to be quite candid, I don't think we've quite done that yet in some of the technologies that have been outlined here. Whether or not we should, others may judge, but I think we should. But whether or not we do, we shouldn't fool ourselves. Other countries are approaching it from exactly that perspective, and they took a look at the model that we use to make ourselves successful, and they've adopted that model, and we ought to consider doing the same.
One key difference.
Go ahead. I was going to say, we definitely need the plan, but let's just say we did have a plan. We have a lot of companies and a lot of people out there who are unwilling to cooperate and work with the government.
Yes.
Very technical people whose skill sets we need applied to national security, who are unwilling to work with the government. We need to figure out how to bridge that gap because we need that talent.
This is a very important point, and Teresa, I want to ask you about this. one difference between what's happening in China and other nations compared to the US is there is no daylight between the private sector and the public and the government in many ways.
Well, the private sector doesn't exist, right?
Right.
So it's an extension of the Chinese governments, right? And so we have to be careful about some authoritarian top-down approach. The United States will always out-innovate. The United States will always come up with more interesting ideas, and we have to create a framework to allow this stuff to grow. And it may not just be a plan on by this date we'll do this. When the DARPA that did the self-driving car test or the
contest,
prize, right? The first car that won that prize only drove 7 miles, right? Last year when this happened, everybody completed the track, which was like 750 miles. That's a way that the government was showing leadership on an area to say, hey, let's create some objective that we can hit and see what happens, because we may not always fully understand and grasp the second and third order effects of some of these technologies and where they're going.
And there are a lot of great prize challenges that the government is running that are still out there, so please look for those too.
Teresa, what is the status of the relationship between these companies, including your own, and government? And what I'd like to mention is there's obviously the interest from the executive level and the companies cooperating. Obviously, Amazon is going full in on trying to put the whole government on the cloud, if you will. But then you have a lot of employees. Culturally, there's a gap. A lot of employees are resisting this. You saw this with employees at Google with their involvement in a defense contract known as Maven. You saw that with shareholders of Amazon with your facial recognition software known as Rekognition, used for law enforcement. And there are protests that there are people that work within your companies and invest in your companies who just don't want you to be involved in the intelligence community, with the intelligence community.
Well, a couple of things. One is we have over 500,000 employees. And the greatest thing about that is that our employees all have a voice. They all have a voice, and we love that. But the one thing, we're committed to our customer, and we are unwaveringly committed to the U.S. government and the customers we work with in government around the world. And we believe, there's so many things that I just heard just listening to everybody here, because if you think about all these initiatives that we say government should be doing, if we don't get the skills in place, we can have all the initiatives we want, but if there's no skills to do anything with these technologies, we're in trouble. Right. And today, what we see is the massive skills gap, not just a little one, massive. Yes. In fact, to the point where at Amazon, we have our own internal machine learning university, because we still haven't found that there's really any group that teaches machine learning as well as we teach it. So we're out now trying to work with universities and groups to actually make sure that those skills are out there, because we're talking about, when we get into these technologies, you're talking about complex skills that are required. And so we just launched a 2-year program with Northern Virginia Community College, which is the second largest community college in the U.S., for a 2-year cloud computing certification. Classes will start in the fall, because we're like, we got to do something. And actually, President Rawls, they first launched a cybersecurity program, and they went from like 50 students to 5,000. And they based the program on NSA and DHS standards. So we combine that. So we've got to get busy in the United States with the massive skills gap. And I do think the U.S. government at all levels could really help. We got to push that at your individual district level, from all the way up and down to every parent sitting in this room. We should not be okay with sitting back and not ensuring that our schools are teaching the right skills. So that's number one. That's job one for us at every level, is skills. The second one, when it comes to, I'll go back to your question, employees need a voice. You said, hey, do people want to work with governments? Well, I can't speak for any other company, but we want to work with our government. We feel compelled. I went back to where I started, is that we believe government should have the same capability. Our war fighters out there in the field, our civil servants should have those same capabilities. And government should consider commercial more than building it on their own. I mean, I think one of the things we're getting into, that we've got to get to the point where government has the ability, through the right acquisitions, to move fast, just like a startup does in Silicon Valley. And today, it's hard I mean, we're a big company, but let me tell you, we had the tenacity and grit to stick with it because it's not easy. And, you know, when we went after and we decided we were going to bid the intelligence community, that was because we heard from the customers they wanted us to bid it. And we made a decision as a company that this was a really important space that we thought we could help. And if you look at tools like recognition, as an example, we've got to make sure as a nation, people should have a voice, and tools should always be used ethically. We need to make sure that, you know, you're always going to have bad actors. But like recognition is such a great tool, and it's being used for such amazing things. And let me give you a couple of examples. It is being used today with one of our partners called Thorn, which is a small not-for-profit that started with one goal: find children who are being sexually exploited. And they have a tool called Spotlight that uses some of our AI and is now using recognition to go on the dark web and look for these children. I mean, this is like horrible stuff, you all. And every day, think about individuals in the law enforcement arena trying to go in and look at these scenes of finding these children that are being sexually exploited. And if you can use AI and machine learning tools to automate that process through recognition of children, that's a good thing. And to date, we've identified 21,000 individuals, 6,000 of those children, and we're working with law enforcement officials in the United States and Canada. There's a homeless project we're working with in Washington State where it's a self-identified program where we work with the Sheriff's Department in Washington State, Washington County, to go in and look for, the families come in and say, we want to sign up our children with disabilities or an elderly who may have dementia or Alzheimer's, so that they can look for them if they were to get lost. So there's programs like that that are working.
Has Amazon drawn any red lines, any standards, guidelines on what you will and you will not do in terms of defense work?
Well, we have, in terms of what work?
Anything related to defense.
We have not drawn any lines there because, like I just said earlier, we are unwaveringly in support of our law enforcement, defense, intelligence community. And that's just, when you're working with those, you can't really say, we provide them the tools. We don't build the tools they're utilizing. We provide them the tools. We don't provide the solution application that they build. And we often don't know everything they're actually utilizing the tool for. But they need to have the most innovative and cutting edge tools they can. We cannot let our adversaries have better tools than we have to defend our nation. So I think that's where we stand in terms of the right tools for the right job when it's necessary. Right. And we have ethical use rights. So when the government signs up with us, they still have to have ethical use rights of our tool. Obviously, if they're breaking the law, they're doing something, we would pull that for those reasons. And they sign up and they know the use rights of our tools as well.
Right. I think we have some time for some questions. I'm going to ask just you to raise your hand, and we have some people with mics, but just let me ask Congressman Hurd to comment briefly about this Silicon Valley, Washington gap, if you will.
Look, there's a meme going around where it's like somebody in Silicon Valley saying, how come the first 30 seconds of a conversation in Silicon Valley is, you know, where do you work? And it's like, that's exactly what happens in Washington, D.C. I actually think the divide is not as big as most people are making it out to be. What Silicon Valley is such great innovation and an innovation engine for the rest of the country. They need to understand how help educate members of Congress and the government on regulatory issues, on how these tools can be used in the future, and also to educate people on what can you do with the existing tools. And I go to the whole FBI versus Apple debate when it comes to encryption, right? Like, look, I am a proponent. I'm for encryption. We should be strengthening encryption, not weakening it. And when it came to that one iPhone, when they finally cracked it, guess what? There was nothing on it that the FBI didn't already get, because they didn't necessarily understand what all the different pieces of information that they can get in other ways, right?
Right.
And
the consequence was a lot of mistrust after that, though.
Sure.
And it drove the wedge further. Let's take some questions from the audience. You have one right here, gentlemen?
I'd like to get back, Maurice Sonnenberg here, get back to something Ms. Carlson touched upon. Science, technology, engineering, and math. None of you can function without the people you need. Our education system is in shambles. But more important than that, we have people, universities. Now, I understand in IARPA there's clearance problems, but even that can get around. These kids graduate from some of our best universities in the country. They can fill that STEM area. They can't get visas. And I'll end with one little story. It has to do with Microsoft. Many, many years ago, Microsoft wanted to set up a center for R&D. What they did is they got 600 visas for youngsters. They were foreign, among all of them that they needed. The United States government said no, so they went 70 miles north and set it up in Vancouver. Would you please discuss what I consider to be a very bad situation in this education of STEM?
I'll start there. It's nuts, right? Like right now, you have 3.8% unemployment in the United States of America. That means that you need people from agriculture to artificial intelligence, and that there is a third of the kids that are in advanced degrees in the United States are foreign born, and they're having a hard time being able to stay here and use those skills. And then what we're doing, the Chinese kids, we're sending them back to China, and now they're working for Chinese military, things like that, when we could be taking advantage of that right here in the United States of America. It makes zero sense. It's 2018. We can have an immigration policy that is based on market demand and get in the resources and the training that we need. We also need to make sure, a scary stat in Texas, 2 years ago, only 2,100 computer scientists were produced from Texas University. That's crazy. Like, there were 45,000 jobs in Texas that required some kind of computing that year. We're not producing enough people, and part of it is we're not getting kids exposed to computing early enough, and that's why I think we have to start introducing it in 7th and 8th grade at middle school in order to increase that throughput. The problem? There's not like a computer science teacher chilling at a Starbucks waiting to get tapped on the shoulder and be like, hey, we got a job for you. We have to train current teachers on how to introduce this. And to me, for this current generation, coding is going to be like typing for my generation. If you don't know how to type, you're not going to get a job, right? So if you don't know how to code in the future, then it's going to be difficult for you, and that skills gap that Teresa's been talking about is going to continue to expand.
Great. Anyone? More questions? We've got one right over here, way over here. Sorry, I'm going to make you run over there.
While that Mike's going over there, I completely agree. Even within a space like intelligence,
Absolutely.
there's research that can be done at unclassified levels. We actually we use researchers, we leverage them for our projects all around the world. So I'm all about using the talent where it is.
Hi, I'm Efa Agawu, New America. All of the technologies mentioned today raise some really interesting ethical questions, which were gestured at. And sometimes in those discussions, you hear something like, the American people really need to have a discussion to figure out what we're comfortable with, to set the rules of the road, and then often we move on from there. Yeah. And while I totally agree that it could be really dangerous to make consequential decisions without public buy-in, I literally have no idea what the logistical infrastructure of a public discussion on some of these issues would look like. So I guess I have two questions. One is, what literally would it look like? I mean, do we have the infrastructure educationally with other media channels to come to a consensus to set rules of the road in the country the way it is now? And in the absence of that kind of infrastructure, how do you think that those consequential decisions are actually going to be made?
I want to talk about that for a second. I want to make sort of 2 points in one. The first is, I think you're absolutely right, and it's a critical issue. Look, cyberspace is not just a place where things happen. It's not really separate from physical space anymore. Other countries are building policies and doctrines that couple what they do in cyberspace to what they do in every other domain. So it's important that we come up with the mechanisms to develop good ethical considerations. And by the way, if not our country, others may try to dominate that discussion. As it happens, I'm sort of an American exceptionalist about this. I think we'd actually do a better job than many other countries. In terms of whether or not we have that infrastructure, I don't know. I teach as an adjunct at Georgetown. You may have heard of that school. And I teach the cybersecurity policy operations and technology course. And I'll tell you, my students every year are interested passionately, not just in the technology and not just in the policy, but in the ethical and moral considerations. And they want to discuss it. And I don't have to press them to do so. So I think in the United States, there's a hunger to have that conversation. And I'm glad that there is, and I'm glad that it's here, because I think if this country has that conversation, we can actually lead the way in thinking about the ethical issues, in beginning to establish some of the international norms, and then assuming we have an interest in doing so, in trying to get those international norms adopted by the rest of the community. And as for whether or not that infrastructure really exists, I would turn to you and say we need ideas to create that discussion and to create a more general level of that discussion in the United States. So I'm looking to you to get that done, since you're younger than I am.
Can I just say also that it's important, like we actually need groups to start. I saw this over the years. I've been in tech now for a long time, and it was easier to do this when you were only releasing 1 or 2 technologies a year, because in old school, now that you have tools like cloud, we launched over 1,700 new services and features in 2017. So the debate, like there's a lot of technology, so the innovation cycles are so crazy, and it's not just us, it's all of these companies in here. So we've got to have groups actually that have these kind of conversations, because the only way you can drive real change or movement is by letting people at least have a voice and have the dialogue and say what could work, and actually bringing to bear the good case studies of things too, because a lot of times people leap to the one bad thing. It's just saying, well, hold on a minute. How do we actually also really use all these technologies for good? Because like we said, we're all here at a cyber conference. There's going to be bad actors. So we got to figure out how we can segment those and really use the technologies in the best possible way.
Some of the really good conversations do take place because academia is pushing forward. The National Academies does try to bring together, especially in the human genome editing conversation. And then there are these international conferences where academia, industry go and try to hash out these. But then once the guidelines are posted, making sure that there is that dialogue that continues where people in the American population can then be part of it too. That's the piece I think we haven't done as well on.
Right. More questions? There's one in the far back. Oops. Oh,
Hi.
He's got it.
Scott Sweeto from the Terrorist Explosive Device Analytical Center, and I have a question primarily directed to Ms. Carlson and Representative Hurd. It's been fairly widely reported that weaponized drones are being used in the Middle East, and they've also been used in Mexico by the drug traffickers. Looking at a technology like drones, which Amazon has already indicated they would like to use for package delivery, and taking Secretary Nielsen's comments about the lack of laws that might govern such things, how do we better reconcile these emerging technologies which have already been weaponized and kind of make sure that our laws keep up with them?
Yeah, good question.
He's talking about laws, you take that one.
So we have difficulty passing, we haven't passed a law on breach, right? There are 47 different breach laws in the United States on something as simple as what should be done if someone steals your information, right? The debate right now around laws and rules and regulations around drones is being driven in the conversation on the FAA reauthorization. That's not detailed enough to get at to your point that you're talking about. We need our military planners who are seeing this in places like Eastern Ukraine to have to give some suggestions on, having seen it done, what should the response be? How should we be ultimately dealing with this? We don't know enough about how the narcotraficantes are using this in Mexico. And we talk about drones in the air, there's drones in the sea as well too. And that's a conversation that, I don't think in a year and a half I've ever heard anybody in an official capacity bring that up, right? And so the short answer is, I don't know, right? The longer answer is, we need to make sure that the people that are setting these policies, the problem is they don't understand it enough in order to make a rule or a law to govern it. And probably one of the most important entities in the federal government right now is NIST, because this is a group that is pretty well respected by so many different industries and within the government to come up with those standards and those objectives we should be achieving.
Teresa?
I can't address our drone technology because I'm not our drone person, so I'm happy to get you in connection with that person, but or that team. But in general, the thing I would say that you just highlighted is back to the point that, and Representative Hurd just said, is we've got to keep up as a nation with new technologies in terms of policy, because even if you're creating like policy and acquisition and use, it's important because right now what's happening is innovation is so rapid that the U.S. government cannot keep up with what's actually occurring. So we have to figure out how we fill that gap. And I don't know the answer, but we need, I think, some kind of forum. We've talked about this actually in the past, some kind of forum with our congressional leaders on what could we do to actually bring to bear forums on innovations, innovation kind of council where we could, as companies and groups come together with Congress and say, here's the things that are going on rapidly, so be ahead of it versus always behind it, is I think is one of the things you're talking about. Let's get in front of this versus being behind when it's already happening.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Is that right? Right there.
Thank you. My name is Justin Gerard from the University of Notre Dame, and taking the point of STEM education and kind of taking it out a little bit further into a technical person's career, and myself as someone studying computer science and public policy can see this eventually being a reality for me. But after spending an entire education and career building a technical repertoire, on the alternative, when we have people like spending that same amount of time just making inroads in the policy community at DC, what is like DC and policymakers in general, how are they kind of thinking about creating opportunities for these technical personnel to then rotate into this policymaking circle without pulling them out permanently?
Look, I wish we were able to pay our staffers more, because what we need people that have actually used these tools and understand these tools to help be advising the members of Congress. We need the professional staff at the various committees, Energy and Commerce, Homeland, things like that, that have the experience that you're talking about. The problem is we're never going to be able to be competitive at a price point for those folks. And so how do we create that? That's why a lot of times you have, I'm drawing a blank on the fellows from various entities that come in and provide that guidance and that experience to those committees. And how many of y'all watch the Senate hearings on Facebook?
Oh, I did.
Right? You mean the information's in the machine? You know, right? like that's what we're ultimately dealing with. And we actually need more members that are conversant in these technologies. Absolutely. We need more staffers that are there. And guess what? If you have an opportunity to go make 2 or 3x in the private sector versus doing that, working as some staffer in Washington, D.C., I can tell you what 95% of people are ultimately going to do. And that's why these associations are so important to have this input in these conversations.
But there are opportunities for technical experts in government to participate in working groups where the policymakers are listening to them, and you can help, you can influence things that way as well. And these are great partnerships as well.
And I will say this, members of Congress, House and Senate recognize the problem. They also understand their limited understanding, and so they actually looking for folks to help educate them and make sure that we're making better policy.
And this growing recognition that it's important. Look, there are, 3.7, 3.8 billion people now in the world who have internet access. So if you're interested in governance, and you're interested in policy, and you're interested in the public interest, and then you say, but I'm not interested in technology, in particular, I'm not interested in information technology, that's crazy now. So what I would say is that it doesn't have to be an economic incentive. If you are interested overall in the question of governance and policy in this world, and you have a technical background, you need to come you need to consider a term in the public sector, somewhere, maybe working on the Hill, working in the executive branch, but working, NIST, the national, to which the congressman referred, that's a good place, by the way. These are good places for people with technical backgrounds to maybe bring some policy smarts to the discussion, because we surely could use it.
I will end with saying thank you, but also a data point. Google is hiring AI professionals, AI academics at 7-digit salaries, high 7-digit salaries starting. So that's the challenge. That's one of the big challenges.
What's a 7-digit salary? Right, like that's the problem.
Far, exactly.
Yeah.
But think
So-
about it, if there were so many resources out there, there would be so many, that's the new norm. That should be the new norm, that all these students graduating have these skills. So that's just an example of we want the economy to have high-paying jobs, but we need just a lot more of them.
Certainly, right, to make the pipe bigger.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to my panel. Can you show some appreciation? I appreciate it. Thank you.